All right, hey everybody, this is the It's On Us podcast, and this is our second episode for the third season, and I'm here with Deena Saunders-Green. I hope I said that right, Deena. Is it Deena
Yeah, I'm close
Saunders-Green?
enough. Deena
Okay.
Saunders-Green,
Oh,
but yes, thank you.
All right, Deena Saunders-Green, and I actually met her last year during an event when I came to California for the second time to visit, and it was in Long Beach, and I met a lot of nice, wonderful people there, other authors and screenplay writers, and people that just love, making a change when it comes to doing something in their life, and it was really amazing. At that event, I had bought a book of hers called Angelique that talks about the foster care and what kids and people go through in the foster care system. And after reading that story, I said, you know what, I have to get her on the podcast so she could talk about what made her write the story and
Wow.
what people go through in the system, and I want other people to know about this. So, first, Angelique, first we're gonna go talk about you living in California and where you born here, and what was it like growing up in California?
Okay. So, yeah, I'm born and raised in Long Beach, California, which is, I don't know, maybe 20 miles outside of Los Angeles. It's kind of its own community for the most part, but, really diverse. I don't know, it seems like it's kind of a more laid back vibe. I'm a child of I guess I could say I'm a child of the 80s, so to speak. I was born in the 70s, and I'm middle aged now, which is so strange. But, growing up back then, it was just, having fun, going and riding our bikes to the beach and, just hanging out with family, hanging out with friends. That was before technology. So we were able to really engage with the community and engage with one another. And I was really blessed because I had both of my parents in my life until I was about in middle school. So, there's so many youth these days who are growing up without both parents. And I was really fortunate, that I had that and, for so long. And to then turn around and not have that when my parents split up, that just, it questioned everything, as a child. So I knew that it's, when we have kids who are going into the system to not have either parent, I couldn't even imagine that before I became a social worker. And I don't know if we had talked about that, but I ended up becoming a child welfare social worker just because, opportunity, and it just felt like it was a calling. And I remember, like I said, what it was like to go from having both parents to suddenly not having one. And, I just felt like I could really relate to young people who are like teenagers transitioning into adulthood. By the way, I tend to ramble a bit, so
Oh no, you're
feel
fine.
free
You're
to
fine.
interrupt if you need to. But yeah, so that was growing up in Long Beach. We were just really blessed, fortunate. A great sunshine state, wait, maybe that's Florida, but
Yes.
lots of sun and stuff here. So yeah.
Awesome, Long Beach. So you said you basically grew up in the '80s.
Yeah,
So I know
so
that was
all
amazing.
it feels like all the great music came out in '84, Prince and just all this, I mean, not Prince coming out, but the good albums.
Yes.
And so, I mean, I remember when like Thriller came out, I remember when, people were listening to, all the good stuff on Soul Train and all that, the more pop stuff transitioning from the 70s into 80s. So, yeah, it was fun. Had a lot of good music.
Awesome, awesome. I'm actually working on a book about this kid who meets this girl from the 1980s because it's some time travel book I'm working on. So I'd love to talk to
Ooh.
you about some 80s stuff. That'd be cool in the future.
That's really cool. And I have to say, on a side note, I grew up kind of, I guess what we would call back then kind of a nerd. I was always reading, always studying, things like that. And so stuff like science fiction, time travel, I feel like, yes, those are amazing, amazing things that we need to hear and read more of in our community. So that's good. I can't wait till it comes out.
Awesome, yes, and thank you. And yeah, so Long Beach and Los Angeles. So was it like for you growing up? Did you understand like where you were? How people on the outside always wanted to come to California, and they always thought it was like this, this big, beautiful sunshine place with all the actors. And did you understand that while you were growing up?
To some degree, mainly because both of my parents are from Alabama. And when they had family members coming to visit, it felt like everybody always wanted to go to Disneyland or they wanted to go check out, LA and Hollywood and all that, which is kind of funny because we were really close to LA, to Hollywood and, downtown LA and things like that, but we never really went. Mm-hmm. There wasn't really a need to, but we were always going to Disneyland every summer, it felt like, because back then it was much more affordable too. Yeah, yep, definitely.
Yes, and I've seen that in recent articles about this, like the increase in when it comes to mortgage and rent and things like that in California.
Yeah, it blows me away. I mean, my husband and I have been married for about 16 years, and like I said, I was born and raised in Long Beach, but when, I got a bit older, I was looking around, and at that time, I didn't feel like the rent was affordable. And, we got married in 2003. And, before that, I was like, wow, it's not affordable. We need to move. And so we ended up living in, the Inland Empire, like Riverside County, okay, which was really affordable back then. You could get a house, like 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house for like a mortgage that's under $1,000, right? And so that was great. And of course, over time, some of our income and jobs, the cost of living, would increase and our income would increase. But we never felt like we could live in LA County again because it was becoming so expensive. Mm-hmm. And we finally had an opportunity to move back in. And it's funny because the house we're in is a third of the size of the house in Riverside County. Wow. But the price, oh my gosh, I want to say it's much more expensive. I'll put it that way. But I'm like, I couldn't imagine being, a young couple or just a young person trying to pay rent in LA County or Orange County or any of Southern California unless you're really going out, into kind of the boonies. It's just not affordable.
Yes.
It's crazy.
The first thing I noticed when I came out here was the big homeless problem, and I was like, whoa, I didn't expect any of that moving out here. It's really sad, and it's just something. It really humbles you too. And like when I first came out here, that's what it did to me.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, it's crazy. There, people just think that the solution is always just to get them housing, and the reality is it's not that simple. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because we have a lot of people who are struggling with mental illness. We have a lot of people on the street who aged out of foster care and just didn't have anywhere to go. Wow. I mean, and people who don't trust the system, people who, just they want to be here for whatever reason or because it's more convenient or even the weather. Mm-hmm. Like, you can go in other states and people who are homeless are freezing to death. Yes. So I get the appeal, to being in California. And of course, people who want to, be in the industry, whether it's, the film, into film, or if they want to be in the music industry, getting out here and not realizing that, it takes time, mm-hmm. So yeah, it's crazy, this homeless situation. Yeah. Oof.
Now, getting into your book, when I first started your book, one thing I loved with Angelique was when you had her break down her growing up through the foster care system. It felt like I was watching a movie, like I was tuned in all the way.
Great.
I was so tuned in, and then like the stuff that she was going through, for like sometimes like a horror movie, like when her dealing with Craig, and that was scary for me. And also towards the end when her and Brianna were like separated, and Brianna kind of started acting different towards her because she felt another way, because she felt like she felt like she was abandoned in a way, and it was so sad for me because I just wanted them to connect so bad. And so when I got to the end of the book, I'm like, no, where's like,
oh wow, it's well, thank you. Mm-hmm. First of all, as I'm listening to you talk, and it's been a while since I've had conversations about the novel because I've had to pivot a little bit with what I'm doing, but there is a sequel and a couple of others that I have been wanting to write for a while, but just other things have taken me away from that. So just to kind of ease your mind, mm-hmm. and all of your listeners over it, there will be a connection there between the two sisters, but it's not easy. And I wrote it that way on purpose. And it's because youth who go into foster care, especially siblings, they are separated on so many occasions. And that separation causes so much trauma between, of course, the family, their relationship, their perception of, who had an easier life, who didn't, and just this lack of awareness or understanding about things that happen. And our kids go through this on a regular basis. And, some people are like, why did you, like you're saying, why did you end the book that way? Well, some of our kids who've been in foster care, this is their entire lives. It ends up with no resolution. They're just left hanging. And I wanted to convey that message. So I'm glad it did.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm glad you ended it that way too, because like when stories do end that way, it makes you yearn for more, And I think, and also like you said, like sometimes the foster kids, what I learned from your book, it's no resolution. It's always a struggle. It's always something else. That's another obstacle that they have to overcome. And when it comes to obstacles that you have to overcome, it's like, okay, now I got to trench through the storm, and that's how it was reading the book. I'm like, okay, well, I can't wait for the next one. And I also want to tell you, too, I'm glad that you are taking your time with it because, art doesn't need to be rushed. And at the same time, I know life happens as authors. Sometimes we have to take a break because we're doing other things or life just happens. But I'm glad that you are taking your time.
Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome.
It's really interesting because I started writing Angelique probably late 2011, 2012.
Wow.
And it was after I was actually working with this population. So, as I said, I'm a social worker who worked with what we call transition age youth. And that's basically young adults at that time, it was between 18 and 24 typically, who had been in either foster care, the juvenile justice system, or who maybe were in a facility for children's mental health services. And that group, there's a lot of intersection because kids who go into foster care automatically qualify for mental health services because, first they've dealt with whatever trauma got them removed from, made it so that they had to be removed from their home to begin with. But then going into foster care in and of itself is a trauma, and we recognize that now. And then sometimes we have kids who are acting out as a result of their frustration and, anxiety. And instead of giving them effective treatment, they're often, a lot of foster parents or group homes may call the police on them. Or if it's in school, this happens a lot, whether they're middle school, elementary school, high school, it doesn't matter. But if our kids get mad, if they say something, if they refuse to do something, people are calling the police on them.
Wow.
And this means they're now funneled into the juvenile justice system as opposed to getting the treatment they really need. And all of these things happen through no fault of their own. Kids go into foster care because they've been abused or neglected, or in some cases they've experienced the death of a caregiver. That's trauma, So yeah. Ugh.
Yes, that's so tough. And the other thing that stood out to me too is when Angelique pretty much felt like she had nobody when it came to her getting evicted out the apartment because of her mom and things like that, and she felt like she had nobody, but the people at the I think one of the it's not, I know it wasn't a shelter, but it was something like a shelter that they told they told
absolutely.
her they told her who else do you have, and they mentioned the church and everything, and she realized that she did have people at the church that would help her, but she was afraid to ask. And I understood that because sometimes pride gets in the way for me too. And I know with young people we have a problem with pride. We don't like asking for help sometimes.
Right. And, just like you said, you've struggled with pride. I've struggled with it. We all struggle with that. And yet we expect young adults to automatically ask for help when they need it. My question is, why would they? Especially if most of their lives, they haven't been able to establish relationships with people. Because one of the issues with foster care is that it was supposed to be a temporary solution as families healed from whatever issue they had. The problem is the system, and I say that very broadly, isn't very good with, let's say, being culturally competent, number one. People have their biases, there's not enough resources, and the pressures that we put on parents or even kids for that matter, it's not real, or I should say the goals, the things that we tell them they need to do, it's not always realistic. And so on top of all that, we don't have enough good foster homes. And I tried to convey that with all of the different placements that Angelique was in. Yeah. Some of them were not bad per se, but the system, kind of said, well, no, you can't have a woman who's, making the kids do this or do that. And yes, you can't leave, I'm talking about, oh goodness, was it Mrs. Zarate? I believe?
Yeah, she had was it a Latino name or something? But I know yes. And Angelique was like doing the dishes because she wanted to help her out or help babysit the kids sometime when she went out to the grocery store. Right.
And so the crazy thing with that placement, and it's funny, I'm like, I should remember all my characters' names, but
okay. I did the same
working
thing.
on so many. But anyway, the issue with Miss Zarate is she was actually an amazing foster mom. It's just there were some cultural things that just didn't quite fit. For example, in communities of color, kids do help out with doing dishes and vacuuming and helping stuff. And in this case, Angelique actually enjoyed it. It made her feel useful. Yes. And unfortunately, in a lot of communities of color, people do leave their kids home temporarily while they're running errands and doing things like that. I mean, I remember being 9 years old and being home alone for a couple hours between, the time my parents got off work. Well, social services says, that's dangerous. And I get there are circumstances that is very dangerous. But to have all of the kids removed because of this, I mean, in my brain, I wanted to convey the message of how can we get Mrs. Zarate better training to make her cultural values more in line with what social services says needs to be the case. Yes. It's just so many issues there. And I should say, even though the story is a novel, which is, it's fiction, it is based on either real characters, real foster parents, or real situations that have occurred, or sometimes it's a combination of characters, if that makes sense.
Yes, I understand.
So, Mrs. Zarate's character was actually based on an amazing foster parent that I remember working with briefly. And, she really loved those kids. Those kids loved her. She took very good care of them. But she was old school. She was from a time when it's okay to let the older, more responsible kid look after the younger ones for a while. Again, there are cases where that is not appropriate, but we don't look at, and I say we as a system, as social services, we don't always look at individuals very well. We look at the broad picture, and they always look at, how can we avoid being sued? So, yeah.
Yeah, see, and the thing is, it was education for me because I never knew how the system worked, and I never knew how tough it was for foster kids when it came to the transition of family to family to family, and even with the foster parents just using them to make money off of them. That was something.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, whoa. So I guess that happens a lot, huh?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we hear a lot about the bad foster parents. Let me just say that. But there are amazing foster parents out there who are loving on these kids. They're teaching them life skills. They're doing what they need to do. But we don't hear about that because that's what they should be doing. We always hear about the horror stories. So, and one of the reasons, I was talking about the characters being based on, on real life is our kids, when they go into foster care, because we don't have enough, a lot, the social services is steadily trying to make sure that, they're in safe places, and they're sometimes taking away the license, the license to foster from bad foster parents. But that all takes time. So when we don't have enough good foster homes, whatever's left is like, oh, well, let's figure it out. And so these kids are moved around so much. I've worked with kids who have had 20 plus placements in their time in foster care.
Wow.
I've worked with kids who were basically born removed from their mothers in the hospital because maybe their mothers were addicted to drugs, and they just moved around like, you know, just it makes no sense. And because that happens, they don't trust people. They don't trust foster parents. Sometimes they don't trust social workers because it's the social worker who has a lot of control over their lives.
Yeah.
And so when they emancipate, and that's what I was trying to say, what I wanted to say earlier is when they emancipate, we expect them to go get help. But why would they trust anyone if their entire lives it's just been temporary people who don't necessarily follow through, who've disappointed them, like they don't have trust. So it makes sense that they wouldn't, you know, get help.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a mess. You know, like I said, there are good people, good social workers, good foster parents who are doing their thing. And, you know, there are a lot of youth who are like, oh yes, the best person in my life was a social worker, was that foster parent, but we don't have enough of them, enough of any of the good ones.
Yes. Yeah, well, that totally like I said, it was education for me, and then like a lot of stuff started to make a lot more sense too after reading the story and noticing like when Angelique would catch an attitude with certain people or certain individuals, it was like sometimes I'm like, okay, you don't got to be that mean, Angelique, but then I had to understand like, you know, what she went through at the same time,
Right.
you know, and then I was like, well, it was so great. Your story was so great. I just loved it, and and
Thank you.
oh, you're welcome. And like when I met you last year, and you and your husband, I could tell he's a very supportive husband as well.
Yes.
I could like, you know, I was like, it was something about you two that just wanted to make. I just had to grab the book. So yeah, I think your presence also like as an author when it comes to presenting to people, you're able to, you know, you're able to sell that way too because of how authentic you are. When so going into that, when it came to writing, when did you know like that you wanted to, like, not necessarily, did you like write a book before this, or did you write stories in a notebook before this?
You know, I didn't write anything official. When I grew up, like I said, I always liked to read and things like that. I remember being part of creative writing classes and creative writing workshops when I was really young. Like, you know, elementary, middle school, and then in high school, I remember taking a creative writing class, but then I just kind of put it off to the side and I focus more on reading. And, you know, most writers can tell you they consume books like food, like books are life. And I'm sure you're like that too.
Yes.
But, you know, after I became a social worker, I just knew that communities, especially communities of color, had no idea about how this system worked. And I mean, they obviously know about foster care. There have been, you know, and I should say this, communities of color are usually disproportionately involved with social services, meaning if we're, and this is just an example, if we're, say, 10% of the population, there are times when our kids are in the system at a rate of, say, 15 or 20%. And again, those numbers are accurate, but that's just an example. So communities of color are familiar with Child Protective Services or CPS and all of that, but they have no idea of the how and the why and how do they operate. And I wrote Angelique because I wanted to raise awareness. I wanted people to know that that the actions that they like, their choices impact their children, good and bad. And if they impact them in a negative way because they are children, there is an agency that is specifically set up to look at the safety and the well-being of children, and they're making their families vulnerable to that. And once families become involved with Child Protective Services, it's not easy to get them out of your lives.
Yes.
You know, most people talk about Angelique's dad, Tavio, and they love him as a character.
Yes.
And I'm like, why? Because Tavio gets on my nerve. And I should say, I refer to my characters like they're real people in real life because I spend a lot of time with them as I was writing. Tavio gets on my nerves because he is this very capable, very handsome man who has kids, but he, in essence, he neglects his children because he's like, oh, well, that's their mother. I don't want to deal with her. So he removes himself from her life on a daily, on a regular basis, and has no idea about the neglect that his daughter is experiencing just because he has a new chick and this new chick is pregnant. So let me now focus on this chick, oh, he drives me crazy. And I meet men like that on a regular basis. They are not, some of them are not actively involved with the lives of their children because they are mad at the mothers. And yeah, the mom's a headache, Angelique's mother, Angela, she struggled with mental illness. She struggled with her own and addiction because she was self-medicating. And because he was frustrated with the baby mama, he didn't want to deal with his child. That's unacceptable, And I have I know of a lot of situations where men do that, and then they only become involved, or their families become involved after their kids are already in custody of CPS, or they're already in foster care. I say we need to focus on prevention. I wanted people to get to the point where they're stepping in when they see kids in their family struggling. Step in before the system does anything, because your kids will struggle with trauma, and they'll be vulnerable to abuse. They'll be vulnerable to all these things that they really shouldn't have to experience if they have family out there. So I get really passionate about this because I think of so many people who they could be doing better, but they're just choosing not to. It's frustrating.
That's a great point.
I'm sorry, I'm not to cut you off. When you talked about authenticity, I wanted to make sure that this story was as authentic as possible, without, of course, sharing personal information. But there are so many Angeliques out there. There are so many Tavios out there, so many Angelas out there. I wanted people to really be able to relate to these characters. And so I interviewed a lot of young adults who were in the system. I interviewed parents who lost custody of their children, just to get their feeling, not to say, hey, what did you do wrong or anything like that. Just tell me your story. How did you feel about this? What was going through your mind? What were some of the challenges you struggled with? And that all helped, to really make it a story that was authentic.
Wow. That's amazing. Because when you brought up Tavio, I was one of the readers. Like the way you wrote it, like the way you made Angelique feel about him, it was always like sunshine when he came in.
Yes.
So as the reader, it's like, oh, okay, yes, Tavio's here.
Yeah, so, he was
but
she's
you made a good
daddy's
point.
Girl.
Yeah.
He's fun. Because he doesn't have to deal with the day-to-day struggles of raising a child. Because he can just go do his own thing. He's a cool dad.
Yeah.
He has his car that's all I hate to use that term pimped out just because I'm an advocate, but his car is not, he puts more effort into his car than he does his children.
True.
And there are a lot of men who do that, and again, there are amazing fathers out there. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the ones who know that they need to be more involved with their children's lives, and the ones whose kids are in foster care. Because there's a lot of that going on too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, everything. I'm glad that you wrote the book, and anybody that's listening, please, you have to order it on Amazon, and please give it a review. It's important to review author stories. It helps get more recognition, and it helps get other people aware of the story. So please order Miss Deena's book. And I want to thank you for coming on the It's On Us podcast, and I would love to have you on again, and I can't wait to read your next story.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And just very quickly, if we have any time left, I do want to say one of the reasons that it's taking a bit longer for the second one to come out, which incidentally is Danny's story, and Danny was a survivor of human trafficking.
Oh, wow.
It's, I wrote Angelique to raise awareness, not just with communities of color like parents, but also with transition age youth themselves, young people who are in the system. Well, what I found after writing the book is a lot of young adults are saying, great, Miss Deena, you wrote a book. I don't read. What else do you have? And I was like, wow,
Whoa.
Okay, but that makes sense. I don't even have time to read sometimes. So my company has actually pivoted a bit, and I should say Angelique was indie published through my company, Green Pines Media, but we have had to pivot after getting feedback from this population, from former foster youth or kids who've experienced abuse, neglect, and trauma. So now what we're doing, because what I wanted to do was help the youth tell their story, right? And I thought, I can help them write their novel, and I'm all for books. But they're like, no, we tell our story through art and through music.
Wow.
So my company has had to pivot a bit. And now what we do is we help young people who have been in the system showcase and monetize their artwork so that they can hopefully avoid homelessness, and so they can establish trust, because this is still social work for me. It's just doing social work in a radically different way. And I think by doing it this way, not focusing on the issue, but focusing on their art, it's allowing them to engage with us in a totally different way and share their story through music, through their art. So just a quick plug, if you visit greenpinesmedia.com, you'll see some music videos that our artists are creating, and they are talented. They are super talented. Because we're helping them monetize their artwork, we don't really work with a lot of beginning artists. We work with artists who literally got through foster care or got through abuse by their music, by writing lyrics, by, putting together beats, things I know nothing about. But I'm like, you know what? This is what we're going to do. So, the second novel has been a bit delayed because I'm now back in school learning how to effectively run the company. I'm in a program called Social Entrepreneurship at USC. And basically, it helps you take a traditional business model and use it to solve a social problem, which in our case is, how do we help young people who have been in the system but have now, emancipated and are just trying to figure out how to be productive adults. So after I graduate in May, I'm hoping we can start getting back to writing, because I actually have about, I don't want to say for sure, but I have at least 6 more novels based on each of the characters at the transitional age, the transitional housing program that Angelique was in. So yeah, we're working on Danny's story, which will, intersect and give us updates about what's happening with Angelique and her sister as well. So thank you for, reading the story and being so supportive and for getting the message out there. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm going to let you know when all this is posted and things like that. And I'm going to promote the book too. So I'm excited. Okay. And I'm also excited to hear about your company, about what you're doing with the youth and as far as the music and expressing their art form. That's incredible.
Thank you. Thank you. It's all for them. This is like, this was never a job for me, for my husband and I should say, while I did become a social worker and, actually got my graduate degree in that, this is a ministry for us. And this is how, we're trying to change lives in our community. So thank you. I'm glad to hear that your life was changed by the book, even the times it made you angry.